Hey, what's going on there guys? Jack here from Integrity, and in this video we'll be converting this rather romantic image of this couple here by Christian Newman into a 3D animation, all from using the Parallax projection system. The challenge here will be creating a mask from the trees and masking the sky in the background and making it all seem as seamless as possible. Now we could use horizon as we see the subject standing here on solid ground, but the ground cuts off at the bottom here as we can see where it goes down into the bank. So it's kind of almost like a flat plane, so we can bend the rules slightly by placing the subject and the ground here into one layer. So let's just get started and jump into Photoshop. First, what we'll do with the image within Photoshop is duplicate this locked background layer by clicking and dragging it down to this new layer little button over here. This will create a duplicate of this locked background layer, and one which we can work on, of course. So first what we'll do is select the new duplicate and then select the quick selection tool. First things first, we'll make a selection from the people and the ground here. Doesn't need to be perfect, but nearly mostly there is good enough. Next, we'll hit this select and mask function at the very top of the Photoshop window here. Now you may see something that looks a tad different as we have the view here set to overlay, which makes sense to us. So if you're a little bit confused about why everything is red, just ensure to change the view. First, we'll magnify into our subjects here, and then we'll begin finiting the mask, and we can use two tools to do so here. First, there is the brush tool just over here, which we'll use for this section just above the shoe, and we'll use this to get mostly the way there. We can leave a pixel or two gap here, as we can then use the refine edge brush, which will tighten that gap, and at the same time will not take off too much from the foot itself. We'll continue to use the refine edge brush on a small brush setting, of course, and if we bump into areas like this where the man's hand isn't included within the mask and it's going to be quite annoying to get right, we can swap back out to the brush tool here and include those areas within this selection. If it's a little bit tricky like this hair here, we can get mostly the way there using the brush tool and then use the refine edge brush tool to again refine those edges so we can have a result next to perfect. Again, we'll repeat this process with large sections like this, get mostly the way there with the brush tool and then swap out for the refine edge brush. We'll repeat that process with the subjects here until the mask is perfect, and then we'll work on the floor here too. Just finite it and ensure that it's just as perfect as we can get it. Refine edge brush is actually pretty good at this, so you'll have a near enough perfect mask if the overlay is close to the edges here. No need to get too OTT, just make sure to stick to a small brush, otherwise you might end up with some weird holes punched through your layers. So we should end up with a result like this, which is okay. The next step is just to navigate over to Output 2 and change this drop down from Selection to New Layer with Layer Mask, which of course will take this mask and place it into another layer. Once of course we're done, we just need to hit OK. The next thing that we need to do is remove this couple from the total image, and the way that we can do that is through the use of Content Aware Fill. So what we all want to do is hold Control and click on the mask, then disable this mask layer, and then re-enable the layer below it while ensuring it is also selected. We'll then go up here to select and then down to this modify attribute over here and then click on expand here. We'll leave the expansion here to around 25 pixels. The reason why we want to give Content Aware some amount of breathing room is because we don't want it to select anything from the outline, say for example like hair, skin or clothes, and apply that to the Content Aware fill that we're going to be placing over it. In turn, this will just make our lives just a little bit more easier. The next step is to right click on the selection here with the selection tool still in play and hit this fill, which will bring up this menu here. The next step is to make sure that this content is set to Content Aware, and of course once you're done you should just hit OK. Once that's all completed, we should see something like this where Photoshop has attempted to guess what is behind this image. It's not too bad of a result here, there are certainly worse, So let's just get to fixing this up and making it a little bit more believable. Now the first step is just leaving this new layer off and ensuring that the background copy is selected. Next, we'll swap out to the spot healing brush and rename the background copy to something like clean plate, as this will ultimately be our background when we separate this out into another layer. Now, of course, is the time to start cleaning this image. What we'll be doing is just using the spot healing brush to subtly remove some of these distortions that we're seeing, like the hard edges, which are remnants of our selection. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it does need to look a little bit more natural. Otherwise, when we get to the projection stage, it will look quite obvious. Now, once we're happy, we'll swap out for the clone stamp tool and finite the area here at the bottom, near where the trees are. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect as we won't see some of this, and when we get to the projection stage, it will be covered by that front layer. We just want to make it seem like this tree continues down and we have no distortions or remnants of plants in the water area that content aware has so helpfully dropped off. At the end, we should have a result like this, where it's mostly clear. We don't see too many distortions, but at the same time, it's not picture perfect, and really, it doesn't need to be. So let's just use the objects here in the foreground to create the next mask. What we'll do here is swap out for the quick selection tool again and get as much as these bushes and trees in this selection as possible. This selection doesn't need to be perfect though, we can just sort that out in a second. So don't worry about being meticulous at this stage and getting the gaps, say for example, between the tree branches here where we're seeing the sky and water. When we're finished, we'll just go over to select and mask again and then click on this refine edge brush here. We're going to be using this to finite the edges, and we can use a larger brush size as refine edge brush tool is pretty good at hunting down edges of trees and brushes and edges and stuff like that. Another thing to consider is that we'll probably won't see all of this, especially at the bottom here, so we can afford to spare some effort. We mostly just want to make sure that the gaps between the trees haven't got any sky in them. This looks okay, good enough, so let's go back over to the output 2 and change this to new layer with layer mask. As you can see, Photoshop has now moved that masked layer on top of our subjects, but you can also see Refine Edge Brush has done an exemplary job here in excluding out the trees and bushes here. Right, so first off, let's just bring back our selection, then disable this new layer with the mask, and then go back to this clean plate layer, making sure to have it selected. We're now going to be creating our clean plate. Okay, the background. Right, so let's just get cracking on then. Next step here, much like last time, is to expand the mask. We'll go back to selection here, then go to modify, and finally hit expand. We'll bring this expansion up to around 35 pixels here, and much like last time, use content aware by right clicking and then selecting fill, finally making sure that contents is set to content aware fill and then hitting OK. Now the next part might get a little bit tricky, as what content aware has done is remove the sky and replace it with this lake here. Again, sometimes content aware is less than infallible, so we're essentially going to need to recreate the sky and horizon in the background. Let's get to that now by first selecting the patch tool and removing all these smaller distortion and noise we're seeing on screen where we expect the lake to be, and by doing so we can make the image just that much cleaner and more carefully plot our next plan of attack from here. So once we're done with that, we'll disable and re-enable the clean plate layer to ascertain what the background should look like and what we expect to see behind these trees. This might require a little bit of imagination. So we want the horizon to cut off near to where this mountain ridge is. So we're going to need to recreate that ridge in the horizon. We can do so by using the pen tool and creating the mask along where that ridge is within the original image. Then we're going to select everything below and of course convert it to a selection by going over to paths and then control clicking on this work path here, which will convert that pen mask into a selection. From there, we'll want to feather the edges of this path to replicate the fuzziness of that out of focus ridge in the background. If we don't feather this selection, what we're about to do next will look slightly odd and too sharp. we'll ensure that the feather is set to something like 5 pixels. Doesn't need to be too much, just a replicate of that out of focus effect in the background. From there, we'll want to select the brush tool and hold Alt on the keyboard to bring up the color picker. And then what we're going to do is just select any part of the mountain ridge in the background of the original image. The next step is to re-enable and select the clean plate layer, and whilst using a soft brush with a flow like 10%, what we're going to do is just paint in that mountain in the background. Quite clever. Effectively, what's being done is we're using the color data from that out of focus mountain range to repaint it in to make it seem more seamless. And that selection here will hold this in place so we don't paint over to where we want the sky to sit. We can bring the brush hardness up and down and select other parts of the background within the clean plate to make it seem even more seamless. Maybe even add some lighter touches of dark blue. Now, onto the sky. We don't actually need to reselect anything. What we can do is just switch out any of the selection tools. Then right click on the selection and then hit select inverse, which will select the opposite side of this selection on the image. The next step is to again disable this clean plate layer and then go back to the brush tool, hold Alt to get the color picker, and then select anywhere on the original image sky to get the same color of the sky, of course. And once we've done that, we'll swap into the clean plate again by, of course, re-enabling it, selecting it, bring up the size of the brush and bring up the flow here, and then start painting in the sky using this color. This part won't take too long, but that's not the point. What we need to do in order to make this as accurate as possible is replicate what is happening with the sky in the original image exactly by using the same method. So as you can see, this picture was taken near to the tail end of a day, like it's either set within the dawn or dusk period, so the very top of the sky should be a little bit more darker, maybe with some more reds, while on the flip side it should be a little bit more lighter near enough to the horizon here where the sun is just sort of peeking through. It should almost have like a glow to the center of it. This looks pretty decent and really quite seamless, and if we enable all of our layers now, we can see that it's really came together quite well within the Photoshop partition of this course. The only thing we might want to do is take away some of the attention of our background, and we can do that by just ensuring that the clean plate is selected, then going over to image, then adjustments, and finally to levels. What we'll do is bring up the highlights ever so slightly and then bring back down the midtones, which will help differentiate the background from our main subjects and stop it from just being a tad too distracting. A good job, of course, is one that isn't noticed. The next thing to do is finally rename the layers to make sure everything is clearer in After Effects. For example, this couple would be layer 1, the trees here will be layer 2, and the clean plate, well, we can probably just keep as the clean plate. Finally, with the most difficult part of this class over and done with, let's move on to animating within Parallax. What we'll do first is boot up Parallax by jumping into the Photomotion folder, then Parallax, and finally double-clicking on the Parallax After Effects project. No applications nor plugins needed here, just wait to load, and next, just double click on the Start Parallax button on the viewport here. Next, we'll double click on this Add Background when we hit the main dashboard here, and that will bring us into this composition. We'll just navigate back to the desktop here and drag and drop in our PSD file, and when we're greeted with this import window, we'll just make sure that import kind is set to composition before hitting OK. Our Photoshop project is now within the project, and we can see that it's now organized out into this folder here. What we'll want to do first is expand this bin folder and select the clean plate layer here and drag and drop it into our composition. Next, we'll just parent it to the parent settings layer above by holding Shift, then clicking and dragging on this pick whip swirl icon here, and then releasing it on this Shift parent here layer. By doing so, any attributes that we assign this parent layer will be copied throughout our project. Okay, so with that done, let's just tweak this scaling from the parent settings layer here to something like 71%. Then we'll tweak the positioning ever so slightly and start importing the rest of our layers. This part might seem a little bit complicated, but it's remarkably simple. We'll just jump back into the main dashboard and double click on this layer 1 here. We'll do exactly the same here to what we did earlier on our clean plate. Drag and drop layer 1 1 here into our project, and then, whilst holding shift, use the pick whip swirl icon to parent this layer 1 to the parent settings layer just over here. There we go, that's automatically scaled accordingly to these positioning and scaling attributes that we assigned to the clean plate earlier. So we don't need to fiddle around with scaling nor positioning attributes anymore within this project. We'll place the trees that we masked out in Photoshop into layer 3, so let's just jump into there and do exactly the same thing. We'll drag this layer 2 into this layer 3 composition and then use the pick whip swirl icon to parent this whilst holding shift, and voila, that's all of our layers within this parallax projection set up. If we go to the main dashboard now, we can just check out our framing in terms of how the beginning of the animation will look. All in all, not at all too bad. So now let's just create that animation. Let's go over to the frame count indicator over here and switch out for the time code by holding control and then of course just clicking on it. Next, we'll bring our time head to the 4-second point here, and then we'll use the central controller just to start creating our animation. We'll first add in some zoom by clicking on the zoom icon here, then navigating over to effect controls. If we don't see effect controls, by the way, we can bring it back by just going over to window, then selecting this effect controls tab just over here. From there, we'll bring up this attribute here to the desired amount. Something to highlight our main subject, but not too far in. Looking good. Let's also add some clockwise rotation too. We can do so by clicking on the button to the right here and then navigating back to effect controls and bringing this slider rotation up. You can see here that the rotation of the animation has increased and looks just that bit more dynamic. Let's just adjust the displacement of those layers by using the controller here and just basically just moving it about. We don't want something too wild, sometimes less is more in these circumstances, so let's just focus on a small tweak that will showcase more of these subjects here. This is looking pretty good. The next step is to mark out of the working area within the project, and then let's have a preview and see how it's looking. Looking really good, and as an added bonus, because these trees are separate from both the foreground here and the background, they give this impression that they're a part of this bank here, as they're on a different plane. And just as what we can see here, it looks all very immersive. Now from this point on, we're really just dotting the I's and crossing the T's. All of the hard work here is done, and there are only really a few subtle changes we'll want to make here. Now we just want to extend this animation ever so slightly, and we can do so by just going down to the last keyframes here and then dragging them along to this 6-second mark and then remarking the end of our work path. Now let's see to adding some interesting elements to our animation. First, let's just get to adding in some particles, and we can do so by just clicking on the settings button under the particles tab on the dashboard and then navigating over to effect controls and then ticking this checkbox under activate particles. This will activate the particle system, which will act in a similar fashion to the layers, so they are fully dynamic within this 3D scene. Now, the petals here are probably a little bit too much, so let's just swap them out for something like this dust particles here, which are a tad bit more subtle. The next step, let's just add in some depth of field. So let's just click on animation here on the main dashboard under general, and then we'll just go to effect controls. Just over here, you'll see this setting called depth of field, and just make sure that the focus is checked under layer 1, which is of course our main subject and the ground here. Now do not touch anything yet, as we'll need to do something important first. We need to make sure that our playhead is at the very end of our working area where these keyframes are. If we don't, we won't see any animation in this depth of field, and it will just start off already blurred. So let's just move our playhead to the very end of the animation and get this sorted now. We'll then bring up this depth of field, so when the animation plays to the end here, it will increase the depth of field and really emphasize the viewer's focus on the subjects here. Now we do want this animation to go back to its starting point after these initial keyframes, so how do we do that? Well, quite simply here by just doubling the duration. So these keyframes exist at the 5 seconds point in. What we want to do is then bring our playhead to the 10 seconds point, mark the end of our work path, and again that will reverse out our animation to the starting point at that 10 seconds point. Let's preview again and see what we got. You can see here as we're playing, the animation reverts back to its starting point after those initial 5 seconds where our keyframes exist, and that's due to our auto loop function, which will automatically loop your animation after the keyframes. And that's our animation complete. Let's get to changing the resolution that this will be in and finally start rendering it. First, let's just go up to the resolution button over here and click on it to bring up the resolution controls within Effect Controls. What we want to do is change the resolution drop down here from 1080p to 4K, which, by the way, won't change your preview resolution. The next step is double clicking on this green export on the main dashboard, and that will bring us into this export composition. You'll notice when the screen changes, we're greeted with the perfect cut system. Now, because our time head was already at the very end of that loop, when we jumped into this composition, we're already seeing a green light for one loop. So let's just go over to timecode here and change it back to frame count in order to better show you guys. You can see that our playhead was already on the 300 frame point, but of course you have the option to change this. So you could change this for 150 for no loops, 600 for 2 loops, and so on and so on and so on, depending on what you want to do, of course. So the next stage is, well, just hitting N on the keyboard to mark out the end of your work path on this 300 frame point. If you don't do this, then you'll still be bringing in the whole of this composition into the After Effects render engine, so just make sure to do so. So now we can get to rendering, of course. What we'll want to do is just go up here to composition and then click on this add to render queue, which will bring this composition into the After Effects render engine. Now the default options which After Effects will be in is not exactly ideal for this use case, so let's get to changing them by clicking on this lossless down here, and when this output menu appears, changing this format from AVI to QuickTime, which is a far better codec in this use case. Finally, after, we'll just hit OK on the menu here, and then just ensure that the output to over here is somewhere convenient for you. In our case, it's to the desktop. All what's left to do, of course, is just hit render from this point. If you want an MP4, by the way, to upload onto social media, don't forget that you can use Adobe Media Encoder to do so. Just boot up Media Encoder, bring the rendered.mov animation into there, and ensure that this format is set to H.264, and then hit the green button. And of course, there you go, that's this animation concluded, and we have this animation with this romantic couple here in the setting of this bank of a river. Don't forget, if you're interested, we have plenty of other classes on different projections, so if you're interested, do feel free to check those out.